Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished experts and participants. My name is David Wright, and I work for the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. Today, we will convene a high-level policy dialogue on governance and the provision of basic social services in East Africa and the Horn of Africa region. This conversation is very important, and it builds on the Secretary General's report, the 2021 Secretary General's report on the promotion of durable peace and sustainable development in Africa, with a focus on basic social services. Today, we have gathered experts from the OSAA Knowledge Network, which was launched in July of this year. These experts are part of Cluster 2, which addresses the drivers of conflict for sustainable development. The issue that we're discussing, as I said, is very important as it will address issues of exclusion, issues of rising inequalities, policies that are discriminatory, corruption, and how all of that affects service delivery in African countries, particularly in East Africa and the Horn of Africa region. So without much ado, I will now introduce you to the moderator who is going to lead this conversation. Dr. Gilbert Kadiagala is a Jan Smuts Professor of International Relations and Director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He was the head of Department of International Relations at WITS from 2007 to 2017. Professor Kadiagala obtained a BA degree in political science from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. He also obtained an MA in political science from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and his PhD in international studies from the School of Advanced International Studies from the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, DC. He has taught for over 30 years in Kenya, Canada, the United States, and South Africa. His research focuses on African politics, mediation, and conflict resolution. Professor Kadiagala was the founding director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, DC from 1999 to 2002, and was a consultant to various international organizations. This is just a summary of his bio. The full bio will be uploaded on the OSAA website. Over to you, Professor Kadiagala.
Thank you, David, and good evening, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very excited to be moderating this distinguished panel on a very important topic, on the question about the relation between governance and public service delivery in Eastern and the Horn of Africa. What I'll do is to, first of all, introduce the major themes that are going to shape the discussion today. After introducing those themes, then I'll provide very brief introductions to our four distinguished panelists who are going to walk us through the discussions around what is the relationship between service delivery and governance in the Horn and East Africa. And then finally, what I'll do is to go directly into the discussion of the main themes that we are going to address today by asking each of the distinguished panelists, in fact, to answer a few questions So we'll have a round of discussions on what does it mean in the region that they have focused their research upon, which is East Africa and the Horn of Africa. David has already hinted on the importance of this research and this topic. But what I thought I would do is to briefly reiterate why this topic is important. I think the first thing I want to say is that both the report of the UN Secretary General and the research that is going to be presented today seeks to address the relationship between service delivery and the drivers of conflict. More concretely, we are going to argue, or the research is going to argue, that where there is no service delivery, there will be conflict and violence. And I think this is a main theme that is going to come out of this discussion. But at the same time, I think we are going to hear that where there is conflict and violence, in fact, there is no service delivery. So that the link between service delivery and conflict is a very symbiotic relationship. And I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. The two are very closely related. The implications of this relationship, therefore, are very profound for Africa, because conflicts and instabilities in Africa have produced the conditions for the absence of meaningful systems of service delivery. And most African countries are confronting this dilemma of where there is a lot of conflict, you are not going to find any service delivery. So that's an important, that's the importance of this relationship between conflict and service delivery. The second point that is going to be important in our discussion is that conflicts and the lack of service delivery is a larger problem of what we are going to call the failure of governance. For over 30 years, the international community accepted that governance is the effective management of public affairs for the common good, for the public good. This is what governance means. That means, therefore, service delivery is one of the main ingredients of governance. But by the same token, service delivery is also one of the victims of poor governance. Service delivery is a casualty of misgovernance, of the failure of governance. And that's why the report of the UN Secretary General and the presentation from the panelists is going to show and acknowledge that measures to improve governance in Africa are important because they need to be accompanied by the search for effective systems of service delivery. So that link is very clear. You can't do good governance without at the same time building the institutions for service delivery. And I think this is why this debate is important. The third point I want to make, therefore, is that service delivery is also the key to conflict prevention. I think when we talk about conflict prevention, we are going to argue that the more countries invest in service delivery institutions, the more they do on service delivery, the more, therefore, they create the conditions for conflict prevention. We cannot prevent conflicts without investing in service delivery institutions. The last point I want to make that is going to anchor our discussion is that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are fundamentally about service delivery. If you read the SDGs, you're essentially reading a testament on service delivery. The international community has agreed, therefore, what are the major services that should be delivered by countries? And what have countries signed up to deliver to their citizens? So the key services that the SDGs actually are talking about are 1, health, 2, education, 3, housing, 4, water and sanitation, plus others. So those are the key basic needs that the international community has committed in the SDGs. But I also want to make clear that there is SDG number 16. What does it say? SDG number 16 talks about peace and security. That means where there is peace and security, governments are able, in fact, to work towards the delivery of these services. So you cannot have service delivery without conflict prevention. There can be no service delivery without peace and security. And that's why the SDGs are important to our discussion today. This question, therefore, we are going to ask our presenters is, how are governments in the Horn of Africa and in East Africa doing? What are governments in the region doing to meet these very, very critical obligations? And what is preventing governments in the Horn of Africa and in East Africa from meeting these very critical objectives that the international community has committed itself to? So these are the key questions that will help us anchor the discussion. And I'm very happy, therefore, to introduce the distinguished panelists who've been working in East Africa and the Horn of Africa to look at the links between service delivery and conflict resolution, and service delivery, sorry. Our first panelist is Dr. Siabuya Mandela, who is currently a regional project manager for East and Southern Africa at Journalists for Human Rights, and is also the former head office for Journalists for Human Rights project focused on strengthening media, human rights, and supporting the peace process in Sudan. Mr. Mandela holds a Master's of Philosophy in Conflict Transformation and Management and a PhD in Politics and History at Nelson Mandela University. And I'm happy to congratulate Siabuya because he just graduated yesterday. The second panelist is Immaculate Liaga, who is an associate postdoctoral researcher at the Center for African Studies, the University of Basel in Switzerland. She's also a visiting researcher at the Center for Conflict Development and Peace Building at the Graduate Institute, also in Switzerland. Immaculate's work is on the analysis of conflict and conflict prevention, conflict resolution mechanisms, and approaches in the intervention of peace building in Africa. She holds a doctoral degree, which she obtained in 2020 from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. She also has a master's in international politics and security studies from the university, from Manchester University in England. And I wish to welcome Immaculate to the panel. The third panelist is Chido Samantha Mutangadura, who has been a consultant at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria in South Africa since 2018. Chido's research focuses on security sector reform, foreign policy, and post-conflict reconstruction and development. Previously, she has worked at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at the Nelson Mandela University. Chido also recently completed a PhD at the Nelson Mandela University, and we wish to congratulate her. Finally, we have Ms. Sokna Ndiaye, who holds a master's degree in international relations studies and practices with an option in defense and security and a bachelor's degree in general public law. Ms. Sokna is currently a conflict analysis and sensitivity specialist for a project in the Liptako Burma region at the Danish Refugee Council. We wish also to welcome her. So the way I'll proceed with the dialogue is to start asking Siabuya the first question, which is, East Africa and the Horn of Africa is characterized by chronic violent conflicts and underdevelopment. What are the factors that drive this phenomenon? Siabuya, if you could take the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Prof, for providing such a formidable foundation to which to anchor this discussion on. And if you may allow me to build upon that particular foundation, particularly expounding on the point of the symbiotic relationship between the lack of service delivery and the prevalence of violent conflict in East and the Horn of Africa. Allow me therefore to submit that East Africa's peace and security challenges could broadly be summarized as terrorism and interstate conflict. The conditions of poverty, the frustration of basic human needs, maladministration, corruption, mismanagement of diversity, and ethnic divisions, so prevalent in Africa, increase the likelihood of violent conflict. Mismanagement of diversity and ethnic division speaks on how service delivery in most states in East and the Horn of Africa is skewed along religious and ethnic lines, which provides necessary conditions for a violent conflict in those two regions. The drivers are mostly linked to governance, whether it is in search for or the conquest of and the destabilization of power or the desire for independence, or to questions of belonging and access to resources in the region. The East Africa region is host to most of fragile states in the world, and the governments of these countries are unable to cultivate or even facilitate the necessary conditions which are therefore needed for sustainable peace and development in the region. And I argue here, Prof, that central to the obstacles of peace, security, and development, and also human freedom in Africa, particularly East and the Horn of Africa, is Africa's armed forces, which have historically been among the most prominent within the domestic and in some cases foreign borders. The case of South Sudan and the case of Democratic Republic of Congo could be cited could be cited to further expound on this point. Africa's military involvement in domestic politics has been the conduit of violence and instability in most of these countries. For example, the ruling parties in South Sudan, in Eritrea, in Sudan and Ethiopia have strong military influence within their borders. This is partly because of the legacy of colonialism and partly a byproduct of poor leadership and lack of political hygiene in a post-colonial Africa. And I also argue that since the 1952, the majority of military coups attempts across the world have been concentrated in Africa. Military governments in Africa have been characterized by gross human rights violation and civil war, which have proved to be more prone under military administration than democratic regimes, as it is very much evident across different regions within the African continent. The governing elites within military governments tend to prioritize regime security over the consolidation of national cohesion, human security, peace, and thus misuse the military power against civilians, and which also becomes the order of the day in most of the cases. Contemporary examples that I could use in such instances is South Sudan, and of course, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Central African Republic, as well as Democratic Republic of Congo to a lesser extent. These developments in Africa provide the motivation behind the militarization of peace initiatives in the continent. The militarization prioritizes the use of military-oriented solution to problems of governance, and especially attractive option for most African regimes who are unwilling to practice inclusive governance, who have rather a willingness of using force as a means to retain power. In the midst of the ongoing gross violations of human rights by many African armed forces, the continued militarization of Africa is concerning for the continent's peace, security, development, and it further jeopardizes the aspiration for peace and development as it is engraved in the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. I would stop there at the moment, Prof, and I will further expound on some of the points that I've raised later.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sebwe. Thank you very much for those comments. Let me bring in your colleague, Immaculate, and ask if she could describe the state of service delivery in East Africa. Immaculate, please.
Thank you so much, Prof. Yes, and both you and Sia gave a very good foundation on which you can build this conversation. And so I'll be picking on a few things that you already spoke about, just to bring in a very extracted view of some of the points that you've pointed out. So just to give a very brief overview of how the state delivery is, I was wondering really how to compare this kind of progress. Do we compare between countries, and which countries are these that we'll choose? Do we compare within countries in terms of time? I thought that would be fair enough. And I think a very fair assessment is also to compare that kind of time development between countries. There's always been this example of comparing a country, for example, East African countries, you can choose Uganda or Tanzania, Kenya, and comparing it to some of the countries, the Asian tigers, the so-called Asian tigers. And the discussion there has been that in the 1950s, these countries were at the same level in terms of poor service delivery, very poor economic progress, poor infrastructure. But from that time up to now, they have sevenfolded the East African countries in terms of their development, and we are still left behind. And the question is why? What do they have that we don't have, or we couldn't manage to get to that point that they have? So if you look at that kind of categorization during or just after colonization, post-colonial, early post-colonial period, that's between 1950s towards up to the late 1990s, there's definitely an agreement that there was very poor service delivery because we just hadn't yet gotten our governance systems together. And post-colonial period, I think the countries are also going through a shift of authoritarianism towards democracy. And during that time, money resources was very tightly controlled by those people in power. And as the system became very flexible, and then the introduction of the MDGs, as you mentioned, Prof, in the 2015, there's definitely a call for improvement of these projects in East Africa, and the SDGs also continued with that call. So if you look at the improvement from MDGs to SDGs, so that's basically the period of the 2000s, there are some aspects which have improved. If you pick a few countries, let's say more or less stable countries, in the exclusion of countries like South Sudan who are in active conflict, you can see that projects such as education there's more accessibility. There's more accessibility to electrification, even more so sustainable electrification, even in the rural areas. So there's sectors like that which have definitely improved. And the question is, how have they improved, or what element has come in and has made it improve, again, that sort of like improvement. Later on, I will be bringing up discussion on that in terms of what has led us to those steps. But just to give an overview, so in East Africa, we have made some improvements in terms of time, but in comparison to other countries who we were at the same level or expectation of even just the goal of the Sustainable Development Goals, where should we have been in the Millennium Development Goals by 2015? Where should we be right now in terms of expectations, the projections that were set there by the committee? And that's where we start really seeing the cake in its form. And it's very muddy, it's very undone, and it's very unprogressive. And at the best case scenario, the glass is half full, half empty. Like I said, some sectors have improved, some haven't. And since last year, we can say that COVID has actually really brought us to a point where we can be honest to ourselves in the state of delivery. Healthcare systems are very poor. Despite Africa, and especially, or not especially, but Africa in general, not having very high cases of COVID. But I think the other people who had other ailments or other things could not receive proper treatment. We can see it in vaccination. There has been a lot of outside involvement in terms of just even if we remove manufacturing of the vaccines, but just the distribution. And this has been there since the Ebola, since polio vaccinations. The government, our government systems have always relied on distribution from outside. Water and sanitation, same thing. We've relied on systems outside the government. And like you said, Prof, part of the explanation for this poor management is really poor governance. In the areas, especially of education, health, water and sanitation. So if you look at the Afrobarometer, you can see that despite this kind of improvement of 80%, really having a problem with service delivery or not really getting these services before, to now maybe about just 54% having it. You also look at the quality of these services that have been delivered, education in Uganda, and also access to this education. So not only is access the problem, but the quality of it. As students are studying under a tree or on broken classrooms. Sia has spoken about conflicts and armed conflicts, not Turkana, South Sudan, Ethiopia, countries like that, even some parts of Uganda. Because of conflicts, the government is, one, not stable enough to provide this kind of services. And also, secondly, they do not have access to those areas in order to provide because of that kind of instability. So for now, I'll stop right there, Prof, to just see if I can expand on some of these discussions as we go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we'll have time to get a second round, and therefore you can elaborate much on what you're saying. Let me get Chido into the discussion here. Chido, and the big question here is that what role does governance play in driving political violence?
Thank you, Professor. So I think when it comes to the relationship between violence and governance, we have to look at the types of sort of how then the violence is expressed. And one of the most, I would say, visible expressions of that link comes in the form of electoral governance, because governance then strays from the management of electoral bodies, but then also just the general regime type. And what we've been witnessing is what you can refer to as authoritarian regression, where we are losing a lot of the democratic markers that we've previously had and some of the characteristics, and seeing authoritarianism entrench itself. And this is particularly visible when you have a comparison between when we had, the wave of democratization in the 90s, and we saw the African Union taking from the OAU to the African Union, a very strong line on military coups. And then recently we see that this has shifted from just military coups, military takeovers, to what you can refer to as constitutional coups that are normally expressed in term extensions. And where you've then had term extensions, you also see that then you start to have political violence in response from the citizens trying to respond to prevent leaders from extending their terms. And then when you then look where you don't have, that type of term extension, you find that the management of electoral bodies in terms of how citizens perceive the work that these bodies do around elections links to whether it's actually a good signifier of whether we are going to witness electoral violence or not. And so where citizens feel that these bodies are not being run transparently, that there is corruption, and that there is favoritism, bias, and exclusion, especially where that bias and exclusion meets ethnic or communal cleavages within the country, then we are likely to see electoral violence. And then also in terms of governance, I think another very important issue is the insecurity that has now been driven by security forces, the role of security forces in driving electoral violence, and how that also then translates into protests and popular uprisings. And I think one way in which we realize that the security sector does work very much as a destabilizing factor is when we look at the role that the security sector played during the COVID-19 lockdowns, looking at countries like Kenya, where in the initial stages, you actually had higher fatality rates coming from deaths caused by the security sector rather than the COVID deaths. And this was during the lockdowns. And you see, for example, I know I've done a bit of research on South Sudan, where the security sector is used by political leaders to leverage themselves rather than then creating a security sector that has a national protection vision. It's really based on leadership. And this means that security and infighting remains a part of society. And then I was looking at the accolade data, and you're seeing that we're getting more and more political protests in response to service delivery in terms of education, in terms of water, and I sort of re-emphasize, especially where this is met by communal and ethnic differences, by cleavages in society. And so I think just to sort of sum it up is to say that the lack of governance is certainly driving political violence, because for one, it forces citizens to act outside of democratic structures, outside of state structures, in order to influence what is happening. And so this is then through things like electoral violence or outright protests, or for example, in Ethiopia, where you then actually start to see armed conflict.
Thank you very much. Now let's bring in Sokna here. And the question to Sokna is, we've been talking about the link between governance and conflict in concrete terms. How does poor access to basic services affect the dynamics of conflict?
Merci beaucoup, Professor. Merci.
Very much, Professor. Thank you very much, colleagues. I am going to build on what Cheeto said and discuss the link between governance, which affects the use of violence. And what I would like to say today is that we often link movements that question results and governance, whether we are talking about demands for democracy, or as Cheeto said, contesting election results, or, for example, protests against economic, social, political inequality, or against the lack of justice. It's very easy to establish a link between governance and these kinds of political demands, but it's much more complicated to link the state of services provided and conflict. Now, if we look at this more closely, actually it's the exact same process. And in this context, I just wanted to discuss three aspects. First and foremost, the state of services, it facilitates the transfer of people to these movements contesting results. It is also the state of services that creates divisions in society, or of the majority in society, between those who feel that they are being favored and those who are being discriminated against. Also, when this happens, conflict is created, and this has consequences of insecurity and instability. So this leads to a limited range of services being provided. And so I would like to focus on these three aspects to examine this link. So the first link, something that we have noticed, especially with respect to, sorry for the term, but I want to say radical groups. So they may have certain demands, and their demands take on a new dimension because they are being radicalized. And this means that they are becoming involved in movements that are trying to destabilize the central government, or they are trying to question the order that has been established in the country that they believe to be inefficient, anti-democratic, corrupt, or not meeting the needs of the population as a whole. So in this context, if we try to create the link, we can see that the state of services being provided can create frustrations, and then this can then catalyze tensions, conflict, and violence. More specifically, we have tried to analyze this, and we can see that in addition to frustration, there is a reaction that may have to do with a perception. It might not reflect reality, but it does reflect people's perception of being excluded, of being the targets of discrimination or marginalization. So this creates a feeling, a perception that then encourages people to join rebels or insurrections. And so here, we really have to think about resilience. There's also a very interesting article about forms of these kinds of demands. And it says that there are these so-called wars of mobilization. And here, if we look at the provision of services, we can see that the issue of governance is often used, whether for the best or for the worst, to mobilize or sometimes justify taking arms. Together with my colleagues, after thinking about this issue, we came up with 2 examples in Ethiopia. So there's the alliance between the movement in the province Oromia and the Popular Liberation Front. Now, their alliance, if we look at it from the standpoint of the history of tension, we can see that often this conflict in Ethiopia has links to the past. And what we can see is that there are tensions, there are expressions of tensions that did lead to violence in the past. We can't say that this is the reason for this alliance, but we can see that there are some governance issues that came up in the past. And I'll give you another example. 2019, the population protested the housing policy. There was some housing that was built on farmland, which was acquired by the government in an unfair, unethical manner. So there were protests in communities affected by this policy. And when there is a will in this context, we can still see that there were a lot of protests, expressions that had to do with marginalization and discrimination that were both political and cultural. And I wanted to give you another example, which is Al-Shabaab in Somalia. We know that the resilience of Al-Shabaab has led to them increasing their power beyond the identity religious sphere. It really has to do with governance, because governance has significantly contributed to their rise in power. There are some very complicated questions that are difficult to discuss because the mobilization of these moments can always be explained in one way or another. Sometimes it has to do with people's perception of things, even if it doesn't correspond to reality necessarily. But we have to really examine this closely because this argument is used by many groups that mobilize themselves and is a factor that explains their resilience. This is what I wanted to say, and I think that we can discuss this further as we continue with our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sokna, for giving us that overview on grievances and rebels, which is a bigger problem in East Africa. Let's go back to our sets of questions from can I ask all the speakers to be as brief as possible so that we have everybody answering at least one question before we come to the end. And see, I wanted to ask you, what preventive measures are needed, therefore, to realize sustainable peace and security in East Africa and the Horn of Africa?
Thank you, Prof, once again, and to the rest of my fellow panelists for providing such creative ideas and ways in which we can achieve sustainable peace and development within East and the Horn of Africa regions. For me, Prof, I am of the view that most peace initiatives in Africa, be it driven by continental bodies or regional bodies, the African Union, the SADC, ECOWAS, all driven by international bodies such as the UN. One thing that they have in common is the tendency to prioritize addressing the conflicts in the surface level issues. They merely focus on addressing the symptoms of conflict, which is oftentimes violence, without looking at the underlying issues which give rise to that particular violence in the first place, which is the reason why oftentimes the output of such initiatives is the peace agreements that we sign or that they sign with different conflicting parties, which are never lasting because such negotiations or peace initiatives were never focusing on the underlying or deep-rooted causes of such conflicts to begin with. And such deep-rooted drivers of conflict speaks into the frustration of basic human needs. If peace processes do not prioritize addressing basic human needs, such as dealing with how service delivery is and how it is distributed across countries within those two regions, then we miss opportunities to achieve sustainable peace. For me, if we can focus on addressing basic human needs or service delivery, for one, we'll deal with issues of violence within the African continent, particularly East and the Horn of Africa. And secondly, we ought to focus on peace initiatives, ought to focus on institutional building organs of the states that are going to be able to hold this peace forward, that are going to be able to make this peace more sustainable. And building these institutions means that you should be able to build, your government must have the separation of powers. It cannot be that you have the government, that is the executive and parliament and the legislature, without any separation of powers, which therefore means that such government is prone to the mismanagement of resources, which is corruption, oftentimes is prone to marginalization of certain ethnic groups, which results to mobilization towards using violence as a means to achieve the needs of the marginalized groups. So if we have a separation of powers, it gives government an opportunity to effect checks and balances, where Parliament, for instance, is failing to address the needs of the people or the basic human needs of the people, then the legislature can be able to hold the government accountable for its lack of service delivery to the citizens. And the citizens can actually use such organs of the state, such as the legislature, to hold the government accountable when they lack, when they are unable to deliver services. So it's critical to build the institutions of government that are going to be responsive to the needs of the people. But where government institutions are lacking, are not even built themselves, then governments tend to rely more on the military to exercise power and to force the citizens to toe the line, instead of government addressing basically the needs of the people. So for me, it's looking at basic human needs and building institutions of government that are capable of delivering the services and addressing to the needs of the people. And there are many examples within the African continent. We ought need not to go to countries such as in Europe or in the Americas to draw examples in where such institutional building has been successful in advancing sustainable peace within the African continent. If you go further south, you look at countries such as Botswana, for instance, you look at countries such as South Africa, where institutional building of institutions of government have been prioritized. We've seen how effective it is. And even in instances where governments of those countries fail to address the needs of the people, institutions such as the legislature and the courts are used by citizens to hold the governments or the political elites to account for their inability to deliver services as it is expounded in their country's constitution. So I'll submit to those 2 points and allow my other colleagues to build on those. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you again. Immaculate, decentralization and devolution have been very popular in East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Do you think devolution and decentralization have increased access to basic services and public goods.
Thank you, Prof, for that question. The intention for devolution and decentralization was definitely to increase access, especially, and I think this was more or less the main angle of it in the rural areas where because of centralization, urban areas of being developed, then there was a lot of rural to urban areas movement. The population in urban areas were ballooning, and the government was failing to hold the population in these urban areas. So in many ways, devolution is supposed to solve a lot of problems, including service delivery. And so it does actually bring services services home. I remember in my home in the Lake region of Kenya, we didn't have electricity when you're growing up. We used to use these lamps. And now, although I live in South Africa, when I come back, I'm always amazed. There's roads everywhere. I never thought there would be roads. And then there's, you can have flashable toilets because there's water. And there's also electricity. Which is not something I grew up knowing. So every time I go, it's as if I expect there not to be electricity, even though I know there is. So for someone who comes in and out, I can definitely see the changes. And I would definitely think people who are also living there can see that. But decentralization was then used to just break down countries, areas within the countries to bring services, delivery closer to the people. Another way this is also achieved is also through privatization. So it's a way of also just decluttering or reducing pressure within the government. So there's not one person catering for the whole country. There's different departments, and within privatization, the government is actually outsourcing some of these services. So your question is whether it's working or not, and this is also very contextual and depends with the governance of the countries. And there's definitely challenges. For example, in decentralization, within governance, we are talking about policy coherence. What part of service delivery are we going to promote? We're also discussing about the areas, the rural areas must have their own capacity and their own revenue. And part of the money that is gotten to increase this public service delivery is actually from taxes and sometimes from aid. So if a rural area does not have that much money, they have to get it from the central government somehow. And then it's a space where you have some kind of negotiation. So if this is not done properly, if there's a lot of corruption, if there's a lot of mismanagement, then decentralization at this point would not be working. In many rural or actually local governments, you can see that there's lack of management capacities, and then information asymmetry between the officials is also not as vertical as it should be, and there's a breakdown of communications in different parts. So I think in terms of moving forward, there needs to be better vertical horizontal integration. There also needs to be a very good social account mechanism for accountability of this decentralization mechanisms. And also, I think something that we haven't talked about, which I think it would be a very good strong point for governments, for NGOs, and also private sector to consider, is also identifying local organizations, communities, and groups who can broker or facilitate some form of collective action within the communities. This is used very well with the NGOs, but at a very local level, very small level. So if this strength is actually used to cater for maintenance and to cater for education within the communities and infrastructure that is brought in the communities, I think it will help us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Chido, this is a question you've already touched on, the role of security sector in driving instability in the region. Maybe you could just speak quickly to that question. I know you touched on it in your previous remarks.
Thank you, Professor. I think what I'm going to do, because I see that this second round is more of an offering solutions, round. So I think I'd rather then focus on security sector reform and why we need it and what are the expectations. And so what are some of the things that we'd hope to generate from that, looking at the context, the governance context and service delivery context that everybody has already put there. And I think the first thing that we need to note is that the security sector is a service provider. It's a national service provider. And so what we have seen is where the security sector is privatized, and so it is at an individual level, such as in South Sudan, or it's very state-centric and about around the ruling party. And so looking at some of the challenges that we have, I would put forward two recommendations there. I've already outlined this in the policy brief, and I think the first one is on strengthening at a continental and international level, strengthening the frameworks on term extensions, on sort of that constitutional legislative manipulation in which leaders extend their terms. And this is because when you actually look at a provision, the national budget, the longer a leader stays in power after the 10-year mark, you see that more of the national resources that are supposed to go to healthcare, to education, actually are redirected to the army, because people then rely more and more on that military to retain their power. And so what we then need to do is to make sure that we prevent the extension of these terms, because what can I say? It emphasizes or it highlights the role of the security sector. And I think the second one on security sector reform is to ensure that what we see is a security reform that is service-orientated and that works within the context of civilian leadership, democratic norms, and the respect for human rights. And this is a way in which it also prevents the militarization of society, because where you have an understanding that the only way to contest, or where violence becomes a viable means of political contestation. So if we are saying that in this region, we don't have certain service delivery, and therefore we need to launch a military or an armed response, I think certainly it's because, I mean, if you have, for example, a peaceful demonstration, let's look at Uganda, you have a peaceful demonstration, you have the security sector coming down hard on people. It then actually helps, as Sokna mentioned, that radicalization, where people then have an understanding that it's always going to be about violence. And so if we are going to reform those frameworks in which the security sector works and ensures that it is, it's about not responding to domestic issues using that violence. And then I do think that this is some of the ways in which we can resolve and demilitarize our countries. So those are my 2 points.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. You've been actually very quick and to the point. I'll now go back to Sokna, just to give you also an opportunity to respond to your question, which is how do we deal with the root causes? How do we deal with the root causes of conflict related to governance? So what is your recommendation on how to deal with the problems of governance that are the drivers of conflict in this region?
Merci beaucoup, professeur. En fait, en faisant
Thank you very much, Professor. If we want to make the gun silent by 2030, well, in this context, there are a number of players who are working in governance and conflict prevention and peace building around these conflicts. I believe that we need to work with these players. Some actions are being taken in civil society and the communities, actions are being taken, and there are some agreements at the regional level, either with the United Nations or the African Union or ECOWAS, working on these issues. So I believe we do need to have synergy in these efforts, and we need to link these 2 dimensions, governance and conflict prevention. or security in general. So in specific terms, I believe that we need to address the obstacles. We've identified some of these obstacles which prevent people from having adequate housing, healthcare, education. We need to assess these, evaluate these at the domestic level and address these problems so that people are not excluded. This is the first approach. Secondly, we see inclusive policies which include communities and community leaders. So in this context, the leaders are listened to, they are respected, and they, at a small level, do bring some significant changes. So we need to include them also in the peace processes. Another dimension would be enhancing stabilization efforts. I know that the military dimension, the legal dimension, and intelligence do play a role, and this contributes to a significant extent to limiting and preventing conflicts. But we must make considerable stabilization efforts in the context of those areas where there is insecurity. And that will ensure that the people, to a certain extent, will have this trust. They will be trust between the people and the government. So I believe we can work on that. And finally, promote dialogue, negotiations, particularly for those who are committed on issues of discrimination and exclusion. So that's what I see, and my colleagues have dealt with all these questions as well.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent summary of I think, the big points that you've been trying to make. We're coming to the end of our conversation. So what I want to do is, Immaculate needs to go, so I'll give her just 1 minute to wrap up, to have the final word. And the final word is related to how would you advise, I think you've already hinted at prescriptions. How would you advise governments really to do better in this field? If you could just go quickly, and then I'll go to Sia.
Thank you, Prof. Within the government, I will just emphasize on the last point and maybe demonstrate how this will be important. And this is to gain that social value that we need in communities. And I think that can come in form also of peace building through peace building education, and also just in terms of development. So what we've seen happen, and especially when we talk about the NGO field, is that projects are actually put forward, but there is no sustainability mechanism, how to maybe make them last, how to repair them, how to continue with these services. If you look at some of, for example, water and sanitation and even health, there's been structures which have been erected, including wells and water points, but there haven't been yet very good communal maintenance mechanism, especially in terms of education. So that's where I think a lot of strength should be. As much as we are building and providing service delivery, there also needs to be better education within communities, and also including and involving communities in these practices, so that they can be maintained, they can be respected, they can also be defended with the communities. Just because the government cannot be everywhere 100%, communities can be a participant in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sia, your last word on governments always get so many recommendations from all kinds of quarters. How do they actually prioritize?
I think, Prof, one of the key things that it's very critical, particularly for the African continent, is how governments manage diversity in the continent. We understand Africa is one of the most diverse continents in the world. So and hence most of violent conflicts, which are very prevalent in the continent, the results of, among others, the mismanagement of this diversity. One way of dealing with diversity is to create national social cohesion. You know, I think that's very key, as it would enable government to be able to move forward from a position of violent conflict into a more peaceful and developed country, or even the continent is focused on creating national cohesion, and also focusing and prioritizing investing more on the youth, the young people. Africa is one of the youngest continent in the world, and yet most of the youth of the African continent is illiterate. It speaks exactly on how our government fails to prioritize education as an investment to the future of the African continent. Because if young people are the future and yet the future is not educated, we can therefore expect an Africa that is prosperous and that is at peace with itself. We're most likely going to go back into the doldrums of war and opt for violence instead of finding amicable ways to resolve our differences. And therefore, education is one way in which we can, government can prioritize in order to achieve the sustainable peace and development, and even in Africa that is prosperous, which is the dream of many Africans. So for me, finding ways to manage diversity, investing on the youth, and of course, more broadly, making sure that the institutions of government are responsive to the material needs and the conditions of the people within the continent. That's the advice for me, Prof.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Chido, your last word on this, and very quickly.
Thank you. I think by now it's pretty evident that I am very, very biased towards talking about militarization and the security sector. But I think certainly when it comes to that, I think I'll always come down to governments do need to have a look at the security sector, because quite often we also I think quite focus on, you know, the government and how they rely on service chiefs, and we don't realize that the military itself also is an agent that is enforcing its way into government. And so where there have been term extensions, the government is, for example, vulnerable, a leader is more vulnerable to allow service chiefs. So I think if anything out of self-interest is to get governments to actually simply understand that having service chiefs so close to politics is certainly not good for them. It's not good for their own political survival, as we've seen with the rash of coup d'etats that have happened. So I do think my last word would certainly be to political leadership to actually make sure that civilian oversight and civilian is the framework in which the military works, in which other security sectors work. And I think that's just, as I said, for their own political survival. So that's my last point.
Prof, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that Sokna already has presented us with very good recommendations in her previous presentation. So if she could just say the final word on those recommendations.
Oui, merci beaucoup, professeur. J'avais parlé de la synergie d'action et de la nécessité aussi.
Synergy in our actions and the need when we are working on intergovernance, peace, and security to link these together. And this is why we have two ministries which are working on this issue. This is the Ministry of Peace, which aims to promote peace building, social cohesion, and to consider issues of governance and service provision. Now, it understands that these can impact the efficiency of its actions. There's also the Ministry of Social Affairs, and of course, its actions are also affected by these. So I think that by identifying obstacles to access to services and by eliminating them, we can move forward. Because beyond equality, this is an issue of equity. We need to promote equity for those who are excluded in order to allow them to benefit from services. And I know that often policies that are implemented lead to tensions because of being poorly understood. So we need to also improve awareness raising and communication strategies. I just wanted to say this on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sokna. And thank you for the presentations from our four speakers. They've been excellent presentations. And I want to congratulate them for really being to the point and coming up with good analysis that speak directly to some of the issues that were raised in the Secretary General's report this year. Let me just say a few things, 3 things to conclude before I give the floor back to David. I think the first thing is that we've already established that that link is there between conflict and lack of service delivery. So I think the point here is that we need to do more in investment in conflict prevention. I think the more we build institutions of conflict prevention, therefore, the more we create the conditions for service delivery. Number 2, East and the Horn of Africa are very diverse regions. You have regions that are recovering from civil wars. You have countries that are going back to war, like Ethiopia has been mentioned. And you have countries that are still at war, such as South Sudan, even Somalia. On the other hand, in Eastern and Horn of Africa also has countries that have been fairly stable over the last few years. So you can point to countries like Tanzania and Kenya, which haven't had profound conflicts. Despite these diversities, however, this region still confronts the problem of weak governance, poor service delivery, and the problem of marginalization. I think if you look at the Horn of Africa, the marginalization of pastoralists, the marginalization of youth, as has been mentioned, and the marginalization of women and other groups still remains a big problem, even in countries that are doing fairly well. So I think the researchers have done an excellent job in giving us some of the key elements that unite this very diverse region. And at least we have a sense of what are the expectations from governments, or what should governments be doing, in fact, to improve service delivery as they create the conditions for peace and security. Finally, I think the presentations have told us that it's not difficult, or we should not give up in the search for the virtuous cycle between conflict prevention and service delivery. I think as long as we live in this region, as long as we live in Africa, we have to be hopeful that we can do more. And I like the point that was mentioned by Siabue. We have to do more in building institutions that are going to create the conditions where our people will have better services, but where people will also be better governed, and therefore where there will be no conflict, where we can live in peace. But we can't live in peace with inequalities, with marginalization, with the profound differences in ethnicity, in race, and region. So we need to invest in institutions. So I think on that note, I also just want to thank the UN for doing an excellent job in commissioning this research that is going to help future generations to think about how Africa should be governing itself better. I think on that note, I want to give it back to David, and thank you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Kadiagala, for the excellent moderation and for the excellent summary that you've given. I would also like to sincerely thank the distinguished experts that have done justice to this issue of service delivery and how the lack thereof could be a trigger for conflict on the continent, but specifically for the Eastern Africa region and the Horn of Africa. You've gone into the details. The idea behind the OSAA Knowledge Network and Cluster 2 in particular is to hear from people in Africa, from the academics in Africa who live their lives daily on the continent and see what is happening. And they can communicate this information to us so that we can then be in a position to advise member states on how to move forward in dealing with these priorities that are affecting the African people. I think you've done justice to this topical issue of service delivery. We will continue with this dialogue in subsequent conversations. But honestly, I want to thank you all, Professor Kadiagala, Dr. Mandela, Dr. Liaga, Dr. Mutangadura, and Ms. Indayai. We thank you so much. I now adjourn this meeting. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.